Hello, I'm Nikhil.
And I'm Shankar. This is Chai Across Generations. This is episode 23 Immigration, the Culture That Endures.
Well, Shankar, you kicked our three-part immigration series off with a bang a couple of weeks ago, and we are now at the end of the series on immigration. In the last two episodes, we've covered a range of topics, from your immigration story and the challenges of the first generation, to my immigration story and the unique challenges of the second generation. If you haven't listened to them, you can go back and check out the last two episodes. That's episodes 21 and 22. And even if you haven't heard those episodes yet, you can also just jump into this conversation since we're going to cover different topics related to immigration.
Yeah, Nikhil, we're heading for an exciting conclusion. You've been asking me some tough questions throughout the series, and that definitely continues today.
You know I have to. Today we wrap up the series by zooming out and taking a look at immigration across generations.
We chat about what it looks like to integrate between two cultures as an immigrant, the cultural elements that really endure over multiple generations, and the differences between cultural appreciation and cultural appropriation.
We'll come back at the end to wrap things up. Here we go. So here's where I get curious, because I feel like earlier in my life when I was coming up as a young kid, a teenager, I probably would have said, looking at these four, I was assimilating more than integrating. Like, I was kind of not as plugged in or tuned into my South Asian identity. And maybe that's just a function of growing up and figuring out who you are.
Right.
I think in a lot of ways, this podcast has been an integrating experience for me, right? To integrate our conversations from a South Asian lens and a generational lens,
Right.
with growing up in this culture. So I feel like I feel like I'm moving toward integration, right? Which is great. What I wanted to ask you, as we think generationally, can we expect integration if we were to look 3, 4, 5 generations down the line, right? Of your children's children, children, or my children's children, children, or is it destined to end up in some form of assimilation, right? Like at some point, do our descendants just assimilate into the culture?
Wow, that's a deep question and a difficult question.
Yeah,
I like that. To our children's children's children. I think that's like a Moody Blues song or something, right?
Yeah, I mean, I can give you a second to think too and maybe share some of the impetus of this question, which is
Right.
maybe 10 or 15 years ago now, I saw a short film called Tamil Inni, which is, it's a 10-minute film, and it documents kind of the experience of a grandparent coming to the U.S. The grandparents grew up in India, their children kind of grew up in India but moved to the U.S., and so they're coming to meet their grandkids now in the U.S. who have been born and raised in the U.S., right? And the generations kind of connect, but at the end of it, you start to realize that the culture is fading. That's kind of the thesis, right? And the grandchild at the end is trying to spell his name in Tamil, or is trying to spell Tamil, and has to ask his dad, tell me, like, how do you spell Tamil? What is Tamil?
Right.
And so it takes a pretty dire view, really, right? On like, it's basically saying you're going to assimilate over a couple generations. We're going to lose. There's no Tamil anymore, right? Inimail, there's no more Tamil. So that's what got me thinking about this idea of like, are we destined to assimilate some set of generations down the line?
Yeah. I'll give you two viewpoints, and I think they'll speak to what you're saying in two different ways. So first thing is, I taught a class on Hinduism. And in that I offer this example, which is, let's say your parents follow the Hindu faith to some extent. Let's call it X. And let's say they transmit 0.5x of it to you.
Okay.
So then how many generations down? It's geometric progression, right?
Right.
Multiplicative factor less than 1. Okay. Right.
Yep.
So from that, it would seem like there's no hope, right? I mean, and that's kind of what this short film seems to be saying.
Right.
But there are two things that defy that. One is that it's not given that that factor is always less than one.
Hmm.
There are, from time to time, always children who exceed their parents in their interest in their identity
Right.
and source of their identity. Number one. Two is we know from faith traditions that there are revolutionary seers who crop up every now and then who undertake mass awakening of awareness and consciousness.
Hmm.
I'm thinking of Ramakrishna or Ramana Maharishi or Adi Shankaracharya. These are once in a whatever millennium events maybe. Well, in
Yeah.
India we're fortunate to have many of them within a few 50 years, 100 years. But they revive. I mean they are somehow able to effect a mass transformation of consciousness and awareness.
Hmm.
Right? There's no denying that. There are people across the world who follow these people.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So one should not underestimate the power of that, is what I'm saying. So I'm quite sanguine, I'm quite hopeful, in fact, that no, we're not going to lose all of it. I think it's going to change, it's going to transform. Sometimes when you look at the changeable aspects like language, culture, as in food, music, dance, if you think of arts and literature, it does seem a little dire. The geometric progression with factor less than one does seem to be at play. I think there is a genuine concern that certain languages may just die out if they're not. And there's a lot of beauty. I mean, take something like Tamil, such a rich literature, such an ancient language. But also there are people who are exerting themselves strenuously to preserve them as
Right.
well. And so ultimately, I think, these forms of expression, they have such a deep connection to what it is to be human. So if you look at the ancient Tamil literature, right, it's so full of spiritual insight, the paths of every individual, right? Or if you take Sanskrit literature, right, you read something like Mahabharata or Ramayana, it's a story for all ages, for all generations, for all people, because it deals with ultimately the human condition. The human condition doesn't change. We all have a mind, right? We all have a body. We have something that's beyond the body and the mind. And a lot of our life, we're just struggling through trying to figure out what's the right thing to do at this
Right.
instant. This is a question that is, I mean, in the same way, I'm not trying to say this is unique. You look at the Greek epics, right? They still survive. You look at Shakespeare, people still read Shakespeare because there's something of really lasting value in it, right? Even today, it speaks to the human condition.
Right.
And so I think those things that speak deeply to the human condition will always survive in some way or form,
Yeah. Yeah. That makes a lot of sense.
right? That's why I'm
Yeah.
hopeful.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think what you're also helping me realize is we can't predict, right?
Right,
We can't.
right.
We can't. And that's not the point. The point is not to predict what's going to happen 2 generations, 3 generations down the line. It's to live in the current moment and to learn from the previous generation, give to the next generation,
Right.
do what we can. The other point I want to bring up here is, I think what kind of upset me about that short film at the time, because it was like, there's very dramatic music at the end when the kid can't like write in Tamil
Right.
anymore and all this
Right.
stuff. It's like a huge disaster is how it's framed.
Right.
Is that even if there's assimilation and not integration, like even if you are losing culture, I mean,
Right.
I obviously want to keep some of the core pieces of the South Asian culture, but what is not acknowledged sometimes is how much new stuff is gained, like how many
Yes.
cycles you break
Right.
when you immigrate and you put your family in a new context.
Right.
So when I was watching that, I was thinking like, okay, so you're saying we're gonna all forget Tamil and
Right.
this is gonna die out. It's a huge disaster. But what about the ways in which that kid, in the film, is going to think about let's say gender roles, let's say treatment of women, let's say treatment of just other people, equal treatment, right? Concern for others. Those are all beautiful things that I
Right.
think were going to flourish with this kid.
Right.
That is not, wasn't given credence to in that short film. It wasn't the point of it.
And that echoes exactly what I said. You asked me, what do you expect?
Right. Yeah.
It's exactly those things that you mentioned.
Right. Yeah.
Right. So I'm completely with you on this. Why do we have to see it as a sense of loss? Why do we
Right.
have to see it as culture under siege?
Right.
Suppose we really took the pains to understand our identity and our culture, maybe not become so secure that we can take the best from others. And in some sense, that synergy could produce something that's greater than the sum of the interactions
Yeah. Right.
itself. I think it's
Yeah.
possible, right?
Right. It's
And think
it's
of
an
it,
evolution.
this is
Yeah.
right. And this, do you think that 1,000 years ago people didn't worry about this?
Yeah. I'm sure they did.
They did, right?
I think I assumed that, like, this was 10, 15 years ago, in the 2000s, internet generation, like, with the internet booming and social media beginning and all this stuff, going through that era as an adolescent, it was clear to me that there are trade-offs in globalization, right? Good and bad.
Yeah. Yes.
Sure, my generation's not gonna have certain things that yours did or my grandparents' generation did, but we're gonna have some other things.
Right.
And the next generation is gonna be the same way.
Yeah.
They're gonna not have some things that my generation has, and they're gonna have some things that are way better than
Yeah.
what my generation has. That's just what it is, right?
Yeah.
I found that line of thinking so outdated, of like, oh no, it's all worse. The next generation has lost this piece of our culture.
Right.
The doomsday story, right?
Yes.
Of
Yeah.
the next generation. But you're right. I'm sure that's been around forever. Maybe I'm assuming that at some point we should evolve out of that as as a people.
Well, I think that's very wise, and I'm glad you brought that up, because I have talked about that sense of loss myself and actually felt it at times, but I like your reframing of it as it's a trade rather than a loss. You give in something and get something back in return,
right?
Even in time and across generations.
Yeah,
I like that.
Totally, because I'm thinking
Beautiful.
For the next generation,
Right.
I don't know what's going to stick with them or what's not in terms of the South Asian culture, in terms of the American culture. I just don't know. I'm not even going to try to forecast it. Right? But to your point, what I can do is do my own process of integration, share with them things that I think are important, and I can encourage them or maybe give them a little nudge in what I think might be the right direction if it's appropriate. But to trust their wisdom and their experience to say they'll figure it out. Right? Instead of it has to be this way or that way because that was the way that I lived.
Right. I like that very much. And that's what I've tried to do, is if you can engage the next generation in your questioning of your identity, how you formed your identity,
Right.
and what you chose and what you had to let go. Right.
Yeah.
I think that's a very powerful gift.
Yeah.
And that process itself is what will survive.
Right. Yeah. Let me see if you have any appetite for this. Just some of the personal vignettes.
Right.
We've talked a lot about this as a big event, as a global phenomenon, as an individual emotional experience. But there are also kind of some, I don't know, funnier elements of it or more lighthearted elements of this. The one I was going to bring up is the Starbucks name.
Right.
When you come from a place where the names don't sound like the names in the country you live in. I think most South Asians have a Starbucks name. So the Starbucks name is a name you give at Starbucks that approximates an American name. So mine is Nick, of course.
Yeah.
Because Nikhil or Nikhil, right?
Right.
If I even Americanize my name a little bit, where I say Nikhil to a lot of my American coworkers when it's Nikhil.
Right.
But at Starbucks, it's just Nick. Because if I say Nikhil, you get all types of spellings.
Right.
I've been called NyQuil before. Like there's there's a lot. So I wanted to kind of throw that out there too.
I've always been the perverse one, the guy who stands at the thing and says, "Here's how I spell my name: SHARBUCKS." N-K-A. Yes, there is an R at the end. Thank you.
That's great. In Starbucks, do you do that at Starbucks?
Everywhere.
Wow.
I'm
Okay, I like
an
it.
irritating, you know. But I don't know. I also had the privilege of doing it because in academia, you encounter people who are a lot more willing to
Mm,
try and get it right. I wouldn't expect it of anyone else
right.
because depending on where you work, you can't expect that. You can't demand that.
Right.
But I've used my privilege to to some, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's a good thing, and I actually think this goes back to integration between
Hmm.
cultures. Like, my goal is not to keep a Starbucks name for the rest of my life. My goal is to learn to say Nikhil in the
Right.
Starbucks line, right? And to spell it out, or to, I don't know, come to some type of term with it. I just do it
Right.
because it's easier, but it
Of
is a
course.
bit of
Yeah.
a sacrifice, right? Of who I am or where I'm from.
If it feels that way, I mean, I don't have a value judgment on it. I think, we do what's expedient sometimes, right?
Yeah.
And that's okay. But if it does feel like one can also take the stand that your name is your identity,
Right.
and you if you care enough about me, you can take the effort to learn it and get it right.
Right. Yeah, I was
Yeah.
gonna say that immigration and identity are interlinked.
Right.
Um, there's that question, hey, where are you from?
Right.
Where are you really
Read
from?
from. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Right? If I said
Yeah.
I'm from Arizona,
Right.
okay, but where are you really from?
Yeah. Yeah.
They're looking
Yeah.
for me to say India.
Right.
I don't know. I
Right.
don't know if you've had that experience, but that's, I think, a common one too.
It is, and somehow it's a bit race driven also, right? I mean, if somebody's
Hmm.
Caucasian, you don't ask them like, "Are you from Germany?" or "Are your ancestors from Netherlands?" Or you just say, "Oh, yeah, I'm from America. You're from America," right? I
Right.
don't know if the Italians and the Irish before us faced that. That would be an interesting question.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
Maybe,
And
maybe,
my reaction to it also varies from time to time. And
right,
I've heard this from other immigrants too, where, at its core, there's a curiosity there.
right.
Where are you really from?
But it can
But
also be
sometimes,
insulting.
exactly, and
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
definitely othering.
right, yeah,
At a minimum, it's othering, and you
right,
feel like, oh, you don't think you
yeah.
see
I
me
mean,
as not, yeah,
right,
right,
right. You're an American citizen, you live in Arizona, so that's it. Well, it
right,
should be good enough for you, right?
right, right,
I agree with you. There is something at the core of it that is mildly put othering, and if one were to ascribe, it's insulting
right,
on some level.
yeah,
Yeah, right. Thank you for sharing that. I think I tend to react to it a bit differently because I assume that they know that I'm not from here,
mm-hmm,
and I don't feel I don't have any problems because I did grow up in another part of the world.
right,
But I agree with you that that's definitely something that the next generation would be quite irritated about beyond a point.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and I think there's an element of it used to bother me more, I think, but as
Right.
I've become more comfortable in my, you know, bicultural upbringing,
Mm-hmm.
um, I I'm okay with it.
Mm-hmm.
They're
Right.
noticing the other side of me, the side
Right.
that they don't know, they don't have access
Yeah.
to.
Yeah.
So sometimes it says more about where we are in our
Right.
own identity,
Yes.
our own acceptance of ourselves. Not to say that we should be okay every time someone asks that. Like, there's some
It.
decorum that we can all agree
Yeah.
to, maybe, but
It depends on
it's
the intent and closeness, and yeah.
right.
But you're a richer and more interesting person than just an American from Arizona. Is a nice way to look at it. Right.
Yeah, exactly. Anything else, Shankar?
Yeah. I mean, I did want to talk a little bit about immigration actually as a global phenomenon,
Yeah.
because not just in the U.S. Um, it is a really this migrant thing is a big deal all over the world,
Hmm.
and it's something I think about. Naturally, I do think sovereign nations. It makes sense that they have borders, and borders have to be enforced in some way, I believe. But it also brings about this question of a lot of immigration is driven by the economic gradient. Not all of it, but a lot of it.
Mm. Hmm.
Basically, life is more uh, you know, comfortable, and there's greater chance for material wealth and growth, prosperity in some parts of the world, and not in the others, right? Now, what I think is missing a little bit here is that it's easy to say us versus them. Let's put down the borders and stuff like that. But if you look deeply into the origins of this inequality and quality of life, the economic prosperity in different parts of the world, it has history tied to it. And a lot of that history has its roots in imperialism and colonialism. Small countries in Europe would not be so incredibly wealthy had their ancestors not gone all over the world and plundered, imposed their rule by force, and conducted trade practices that are extremely beneficial to their citizens in a small country in Europe, much at the expense of much of Asia and Africa, or South America, for that matter.
Right.
And I think to have the beauty of immigration is we can bring that perspective very forcefully to the limelight in future immigration debates. And I think to some extent, we owe it to our heritage to do that. The other thing that's very problematic, particularly in the US, but probably all over the world, is that this is an unsolved problem. I mean, in Europe too, there are various reactions to migrants. Germany has one approach. France and Italy may have others. There are more hardcore approaches in other parts like Hungary and Belarus and stuff like that. But even in the US, which we sort of think of as a very open society, transparent, where the press is free and stuff like that, we don't see a lot of discussion about the plight of immigrants. So, for instance, this whole business of migrant children has really bothered me, to be very honest. It's unpleasant, I know, but we cannot just shy away from something because it's unpleasant.
Right.
There are people who are valiantly doing coverage of this. I personally think it is morally reprehensible to separate children from their parents under any circumstances. I think it's even more humane to deport all of them at one go rather than separate them. But these horrible practices have happened under both administrations in this country. And as citizens who have a history and heritage of having immigrated here, I think we need to fight. We need to represent and say that, look, this is unacceptable. It's a human rights violation, quite honestly. That's what it is. And if we cannot call out human rights violations in our own country done under our government, then we have no moral high ground to say anything about anything else in the rest of the world. And I would encourage anyone, who is doing the people doing very noble work in this. And I really hope that that's another thing that the next generation who are more empowered can gain from our perspective. Like, look, guys, this is not right.
Right.
You can't do this. There's got to be a better way to do this. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. The separating of migrant children is just heartbreaking.
Yeah. And I know that it's not, every story is different. It's not always clean. Sometimes I'm told that it's actually used as a ploy. I don't know all that about all those details, but I still think that it can be, that there are better ways that it can be done. So globally, a question that we can ask ourselves is, what do we owe our world citizens in some sense? And it's not a question I have an answer to, but I think it's a question we should consider deeply.
Yeah.
Right. And the other sort of more lighthearted thing that I wanted our listeners to maybe think about is cultural appropriation and what they think about that. It's lighthearted in some ways, but it's not in some ways. But as you were saying, globalization is this force. It has both pluses and minuses. Some of it can be cultural appreciation, but sometimes it can also be cultural appropriation. Yeah. And I think it'd be very nice if people were more sensitive to that and, not just take over something from another culture, ripped from its context just because, and interpret it in their own way, just because it's convenient or it's popular or it's, and I can think of things like, yoga itself,
Yeah.
the bindi, and you know, yeah, or somebody trying to copyright turmeric or something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, trademark, stuff like
Yeah.
that. Yeah,
How do you feel about the henna or the mehndi when
yeah.
it's
I mean,
used in non-South Asian context?
look, it's you can't stop anyone from doing the
Right.
things.
Yeah.
That's right. I think we can try to sensitize those who are willing to listen,
Hmm.
that these words and concepts have a very specific cultural context. We can try to educate them, um, and I think there are also people who feel strongly enough about it that they'd call them out about it. And if it's done, politely, but within the realm, within certain limits, I think that's also appropriate.
Right.
If they feel
Yeah.
strongly about it. So I think there is a spectrum of responses that one can have,
Right.
and hopefully they'll all be more productive and healthy and educational and conversational, and result in more understanding if it's done in the right way.
Right.
Because sometimes it may be unintentional, sometimes it's
Yeah.
frivolous, sometimes it's thoughtless, and sometimes it's done with malicious intent in some
Right.
sense. Or yeah, so I think we just have to discriminate where it's coming from and respond appropriately.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I saw like a post or a photo of someone at a wedding, and I think they weren't South Asian, and they had the mehndi. I think for the bride. I think
Hmm.
the bride wanted to do it, and my mind immediately went to, oh, well, what were their intentions,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
And I don't even know these people. Like this was just some kind of public post. Uh, and I think part of it was understanding I can't know their intention
Right.
because I don't know them. I can't start a conversation with them. Even if I did know them, I may not
Right.
even start that conversation. But I think that's one thing that's given me a little bit of pause lately is cultural appropriation versus appreciation often has to do
Right.
with intent leading into
Yes.
action.
Right.
But if once you're a certain degree removed from whoever the
Hmm.
person is or whatever the phenomenon is,
Oh,
then you don't know. You just kind of have to be like, okay,
yeah.
it's
Yeah.
happening. Yeah.
Yes. Only in your close circle of friends could you maybe ask, like, say, hey, why did you do that?
Right.
Or what was your intention in doing that? And in a perfectly non-judgmental and transparent way, I think it's an appropriate question.
Right.
And then depending on the response, you can decide how to react.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it goes the other way too, right? We have to be mindful when we learn things or utilize things from other
Yes.
cultures. Make sure that we understand and attribute to the culture, and seek some understanding and not just take it and run with it.
So true. So true. Yes, you're very
Yeah.
right. Yeah. 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 I like that. Yeah.
Yeah. And sometimes it's hard to know. Like sometimes when I see a phenomenon, I might not know exactly where it comes from, right? Like it actually
Yeah.
requires a little bit more to look into where is this. Like I think sometimes here's the thing, right, with cultural
Uh-huh.
appropriation is when a different culture discovers something or a majority of people in that culture start to discover something and then feel that the act of discovering it
Hmm.
makes it their own,
Yes. Yes. Yes.
right? That's the
Yeah.
core of the issue.
Yeah.
And not realizing actually it's got a long history, centuries, millennia back. And that's tough.
That's so that's so perceptive. I think you really nailed that phenomenon.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We all just want credit for discovering things, right?
Right.
Like we're like, "Oh, I found the greatest thing today." Like, here it is. I found a video of Shankar lecturing to his students. It's the greatest thing. But I don't know. It was you. You were the one lecturing in that video. I just was discovering it.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's really interesting you point that out. But yes, I think we have to approach all things with humility and yeah, with that due respect.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I did also want to mention that as someone outside of the first generation, you start to think, what would life have been like if you hadn't moved?
Mm,
Um, it's just a wondering, a pondering. That's always
right.
there.
We do. I think a lot of times, and there are a lot of those questions that arise. We used to call it the N+1 syndrome, which is not this year, but next year we'll move back. There's that also.
Oh, interesting. Wow.
Yeah, yeah. So I
Yeah.
think those are common themes to many immigrant experiences.
Right. Right.
Right.
Well, I'm grateful that you immigrated here and stayed here, and we got to meet and do this podcast. And I'm grateful for my parents for immigrating here. Yeah, some wonderful things can happen. Who knows if we would have met if we were both in India?
Definitely, Nikhil. Yeah, you're right. So, likewise, in the sense that I'm glad we got to meet, and I'm glad we're doing this. So yeah, I think we have much to be grateful for and celebrate.
Yeah.
And immigration is a big player in all of that.
Yeah, totally. And I've actually thought on our podcast we could even in the future consider featuring immigration stories of different people.
Yes.
Right? In some form or another to capture them. But yeah, it's a huge topic that we're just scratching the surface of.
Yeah. Be fun to hear what our listeners think.
Yeah.
As always.
All right. Well, we will hopefully hear from them. And thank you, Shankar, for a great discussion.
Hey, thank you, Nikhil. It's always a pleasure.
So that wraps up the final part of our discussion on immigration. What are you taking away from this conversation and from this series overall, Shankar?
I have to say that giving voice to my immigration story has been transformative for me in many different ways, Nikhil. I feel it has brought me closer to all immigrants, but especially those of my generation who immigrated from India. The feedback from listeners has been especially gratifying. It has also allowed me to gain perspective and what it is like to be the native inhabitant of a country who is dealing with immigration. I try to put myself in the shoes of such a person and try to see how that challenges my own openness to different ways of living and how welcoming I would be to sharing resources, and it has challenged my sense of ownership, both of material things, but also of notions of culture, both classical and popular.
Yeah, it's great that you're putting yourself in the shoes of someone else with a different lived experience and looking to understand their experience too. We all share so many things, and I think a little bit of empathy goes a long way when we think about people from different backgrounds.
What are you taking away from the conversation, Nikhil?
So I really liked your point about how culture can increase over time, just as it can fade over time. I hadn't really thought about it that way before. And throughout the series, you've opened my eyes to just how much I still don't know about the immigrant experiences and stories of my South Asian elders. Actually, that kind of goes for my South Asian friends in my generation too. What are their family immigration stories like? I really don't know in a lot of cases. There's a whole world to share and explore there, and I'm more likely to do so coming out of this series.
I'm so glad this was a fruitful conversation and experience for both of us, Nikhil. That's really what I love about our interaction. We're constantly learning from each other and challenging each other to grow in new ways. I feel a deep sense of gratitude and fulfillment from this series we just wrapped up.
Me too, Shankar. That's so well said. And thanks to everyone for listening to the series on immigration. We'd love to hear from you through our Instagram page, Chai Across Generations, or our email at chaiacrossgenerations@gmail.com.
As always, subscribe to our podcast and please leave us a rating on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. This really, really helps new people find our show, and we want to thank you all for listening.
See you all next time.